So if you have a fiber laser, then you've probably already watched tons of videos where people create coins that look like this. The big problem, though, you're going to run into is that they often don't take you through the end-to-end process from design to final product, and they typically leave much to the imagination, and nobody likes magic when you're trying to make something. So I'm going to share my top tools, techniques, tips, and tricks to help you laser engrave coins like a pro so you too can create stunning designs in no time at all. Let's get going. So my goal here is to document a process for making coins, medals, awards of merit. If you have a business, you might be asked by a customer to do that, years of service type medals. Any of those will work with this process. What I want to do is show you each of the steps in detail that I do, why you do them, and I'm going to use some tooling that I use in my actual process. You can certainly use that tooling, but I'll warn you in advance, most of those tools cost money, and I will put links down below if you're interested in them, but my goal here is not to sell tools. My goal here is to document that process and show you what to do. So where there's alternatives to things that I'm doing, I'll point them out. Now, I will warn you in advance, the reason I use these tools and pay money for them is because the alternatives tend to be a little more tedious, but they will be free and you can certainly use them. Now, before we dive in too deep, I will point out that there's one absolute requirement for this video in order to make coins, and that's to have a fiber laser. So it can be any fiber laser. I'm going to use my Commarker B660 watt laser, but if you have something like an F1 Ultra where you have a 20 watt fiber laser, it will work just fine. Really, the power only impacts the amount of time it's going to take to do an engrave. So don't feel that because you have a small fiber, it's not going to work, because everything here will work. But I did want to point out that one absolute requirement. And with that, let's get started with the first step, which is the design. So to create this coin, I'm going to use AI, and I'm going to use my favorite design tool, Kittle, to make all of this happen. There are alternatives. I'll talk about those in a second. But what I've done here is I just created a canvas that's 1200 by 1200 pixels. You can see it there. And I'm going to use AI to generate this. So Kittle has a very nice AI option. And you have two different engines you can use. You can use the DALL-E 3 engine, which is a little older, and you can use the Flux AI engine. I'm going to use that one because I just like the output of it. I'll just paste my query in here so you don't have to watch me type a whole bunch of incorrect characters. So the query is, I want no shadows because I don't want to obscure that image. I want a bas relief grayscale, and I want a queen's profile with a white outer circular ring. And the outer ring is just in case you wanted to put some text or something on. So I'll just generate that image. And you can see it generated a pretty reasonable image here. So I'll take it and I'll stretch it to the whole extent of my canvas. And I don't want the background, so what I'll do is I'll try and remove it. Now we have to be careful because it could remove the inside, and then we'll have to do some kind of remedy for that. But in this case, it was smart enough to do just remove the outer background. So this is perfect. There's a couple of spots here where it might be a little white, which will blow out the final coin image. So what I'm going to do is just reduce the contrast a little, and you can see particularly on the nose here where it became a little more gray, so it's a little more contoured, and that means we can preserve a lot of that data rather than getting it blown out into a high level on the coin. So there it is. You saw how easy it was to generate the head side of a coin. So I'll just export that, save it on my computer, and we're ready to go to the next step. But before I do, let me talk about some of the alternatives. So if you don't want to use AI, maybe you have a photo, you could certainly use that for this next step. You could also go to Google Images. If you just wanted to find a coin head, you could search for that and pick one out. You could also look for a bas relief if you want to refine that a bit more. And finally, if you have maybe an STL file for 3D printing, you could create an image of that and export just the STL file, and you could use that. I'm not going to do any of those because it's too hard and I'm too lazy. This way worked perfectly for me. Yes, it does cost you, I don't know, $10 a month, but it's well worth the time, in my opinion, to use something like Kittle or other AI tools to generate these, and there's lots of them around. The next step in this coin making process is really the hardest step, and it's not particularly hard, but it's the most detailed, and if you use the right tool, it can actually be easy. There are lots and lots of height map generating tools. I've used them all, and for the most part, they range from very complex meandering through command lines to execute things to ones that are really just pretty simple, and they'll generate a height map for sure, but it won't be very good detail, and I'll show you the difference here. The tool I've chosen to use here is one called Sculpt OK, and it is by far the best one I've seen. Now, I'll warn you in advance, it's not free. There is a free version, as you can see here. You can try it out to play around with it to make sure it'll do what you want to do. But if I look at the pricing here, you'll see there's a good range of pricing from certainly that free one up to, $19 a month gives you 400 credits, which is plenty, honestly. And then it progresses up from there. Now, the good thing is they also have a package. They also have a plan where you can buy additional credits, and you can see for $15 you can get 200 credits. So even if you're buying and you buy, say, this cheapest plan, and you use this a lot to generate height maps, maybe you have a CNC business or whatever, anywhere where you're generating those kind of images, then you can buy a package of credits separately, and basically every time you generate an export, you're consuming a credit. So that's the model. Again, people will certainly leave comments down below to say, this is too expensive, and for some people, definitely it might be. Play with the free version and see if you like it, and maybe it'll change your mind. With that, I'll hop over to the actual map generation tool, and you can see it's got a big plus sign here. It wants me to import my file, and I'll just pick the one I generated from Kittle. And again, you would generate your own. You can see down here, actually, you can load photos. So if you had a photo of, your famous Uncle Joe, you could actually put him on a coin here. So my coin is very crisp. There's not a lot of error correction I need to do. I've already removed the background, so I don't have to do that. All I really need to do is generate it. And you can see there's a draw button down here, and I can click that, and it'll go through a long process here to generate the actual images, and it'll give you 4 different ones. The first one is the one that a lot of height map tools generate, and it'll come out very quickly, as you see. The next couple will progressively improve the image, and it'll take a bit longer. You can see there's now 4 images. I mentioned the first one is the one that typically you would get with some of those free height map generators. The second one has a little more detail, so you can start to see the outline of the hair and the crown, but it's still a little fuzzy. Then the last 2 here, you'll see there's a lot more detail in this one, and it may be the one we want to use. And then there's the final one, which has kind of the ultimate detail, so you can actually see kind of texture in the hair and a lot of crisp detail in the crown. So you can take any of these. Now, the one thing you'll notice about this last one is I mentioned dealing with color. The contrast here around the face is probably very high, so we could soften that up if we wanted to, but I'm actually going to take this one. I think it's probably the nicest one that we can get for a coin. Not too much high intensity blowout here, and this will be fairly easy to correct. So I'll download that one, and once I download it, it will remove the watermark, and that's when you basically pay a credit. You can see my credits up in the corner here. All right, so we started with an image that was AI generated, although again, you could use your own photo if you want. We then turned it into a height map using Sculpt OK, and hopefully you've seen so far that none of this is really all that difficult. It was mostly standing around watching some AI tool do some magic. But now we have to do the actual heavy lifting in this video. We have to engrave this coin. And this is where things will deviate a little bit. If you don't have the same laser I happen to be using, then you're going to have to play with the settings, and I'll talk a bit about that. There's also a couple of other pitfalls that I want to call out here. But first, let's dive into Lightburn, and I'll show you what I did to set up here. So first I drew an orange circle in the center of the workspace. That orange circle is a tool path, and it's the exact diameter of my coin, and that's used for positioning the coin as well as this image. So I'll put the image in the center of that as well. Now, if you have a physical border on the outside rim of your coin, you might want to make this image a bit smaller. Taking a look at the settings here for the engrave, there's two sub-layers here. The first one is the 3D slice, which takes this image and slices it to actually generate a depth engrave. 2000 millimeters a second, 95% power, 100 kilohertz of frequency, and the pulse width here is 200 nanoseconds. I used a 0.025 dot per inch layer interval, and of course it's 3D slice and 256 layers. Now, the second subtask is the cleanup, and every 10 engraved layers I'm going to do just a quick cleanup pass, and it'll be a little bit faster, definitely a lot less power, so about 30% power, and the frequency there will be 80 kilohertz. So it'll generate a whole lot less power, and it'll just clean off the surface. So those are the settings for the engrave, and again, this is for my 60 watt MOPA. If you're using a different laser, maybe you have an F1 Ultra and you want to do this, that's a 20 watt fiber laser, so you're going to have to do some adjustments to the settings here. For example, the speed's probably too fast at 2000 millimeters a second. You're probably going to want to go down to 1000. If you're using a different laser, you may have to play with the settings to get both the depth of engrave and just the overall engraving quality that you want. But it's doable with a 20 watt laser for sure. I've used 20 watt fiber lasers in the past, and it works fine. Now, before we actually start the engrave, I did want to bring up a fairly iffy subject here. I've seen really bad coins out there for blanks, and I just want to make you aware of something. So what I have here is two coins that I've set down, and I'll take a magnet to them. The one on the right doesn't react to the magnet, which means it's solid brass. The one on the left, however, you can see is very magnetic, which means it has a lot of ferrous material in it. This is not a good coin for engraving, and if you do engrave with it, what you'll get is a piece of junk that looks like this, and that's not going to work. You can't polish it. It's just terrible. So be very cautious of things that you buy on Amazon. The only real coins I've seen on Amazon that I know work well are the ones from ComMarker. They're not endorsing this video in any way, so don't assume anything, but those ones are actually really good solid brass. The one downside of those is that they tend to be a little thinner, and they're actually the coins I'm using in this video. They're actually thinner. They're only about a little slightly under 3 millimeters, which means if you have a deep engrave on one side, it's not going to be deep enough. It's not going to be thick enough to engrave on the other side. So if you want to do two-sided engraving, you're going to have to get 4 millimeter coins. With all the coin concerns out of the way now, I'll place the coin on a piece of stainless steel here, just so if I go off the edge, it doesn't wreck my workspace. And I'm showing you the first layer engraving here in real time, and you'll notice that it's just engraving the whole surface. There's no unengraved material where the image would be. And that's important because if you see that on the first layer, that means you're going to have flat spots in the image. And those are just hard to work with because they'll end up being shinier than you would expect. Now I jumped ahead a bit here to show you in real time a couple of different steps of progress, and here it's about half finished, and then we're almost finished. Here you can see it definitely looks more well defined and comes out pretty nicely, but when I look at the result, you might say, hey, wait a minute, this looks terrible. Well, that's because there's a common misconception that a coin will look fantastic when it comes off the laser. The laser basically is like a fairly coarse file. Keep in mind, it engraved a couple of millimeters of brass away from this coin, so it's not going to be smooth. The way to solve that is the next step, and that's to do some final finishing here. Now, when it comes off the laser, it'll be pretty rough, and sometimes you'll get these flat spots. The way to solve those is to just rough them up with a bit of sandpaper just to get them smooth. and take off that flat surface. Otherwise, when this comes out of the polisher, that flat spot will just be shinier and shinier, and it'll look kind of strange compared to the rest of the coin. And now we're ready to polish, so I'll just put some water in my polisher. There's already some pins in there, and a bit of this Shine Bright, which just makes things come out a little cleaner, a little shinier. Throw the coin in there and turn on the machine. And we want to give it about 20-25 minutes. Maybe you do it again after and just let it sit there. And it spins away. Sometimes you'll get a bunch of this foam, but it just keeps turning. And when you get the final result, you can see it's a lot shinier than it was when we put it in. And it doesn't look too bad, but you may not want it to be as shiny as that, so you may want to make it look more antique-y. And the way to do that is to use this stuff called brass black. It comes in a bottle. Now, there's a bunch of different ways you can put this on. I just take one of these hobby paintbrushes and just paint it on, let it sit for a while, and then rub it off with a paper towel. And if that's not sufficient for you, you can use something like a microfiber cloth to buff it. Or if you want it even shinier after, you can just use a bit of stainless steel wool. And you can see it, you still have the antique look in the back, but the figure is shiny. And if you want it even shinier than that and make it look a little more worn, you can just put it on a pad buffer on your drill press and shine it up. And then you get that nice kind of aged effect as opposed to something that looks, super manufactured. Now, of course, you don't need one of these fancy magnetic polishers. They work great, and I'll put a link in the description down below. But honestly, if you're making a single coin, or you're just really not going to make that many and you can't justify it, then by all means use steel wool and some Scotch-Brite of some sort, Scotch-Brite pads, and you can polish these coins up pretty decently. Be careful though when you're doing it by hand, because you can lose some of the detail. Now, the last thing you're going to need to know about these if you have a side hustle or a business is how to sell them. And you can get good money for these. I mentioned some applications up at the front of this video, but if you're maybe making something for a team or tournaments, you can make these. And if you're interested in finding out how to price things, then click the video up in the corner and go watch that, and I'll see you over there. And I'll say get out there, make your world, and I'll see you next time.